Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm your host, Steve Barnes. In this episode, we'll be looking at some promising approaches and responses that will help address how to reduce as well as prevent errors in our criminal justice system. Recent scientific advances, including in DNA testing, as well as the growth of the Innocence Project, have helped increase the public's awareness about errors in the system, calling into question its fairness and accuracy. So today, we'll examine how to prevent unintended and sometimes tragic outcomes. And importantly, by engaging some of the key actors in the criminal justice system, including prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, law enforcement, media, and importantly, the public. We're fortunate to have with us today two experts who can help us examine some of these issues. First is John Hollway. He's the Executive Director of the Quatrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice here at Penn Law, and he's also the author of the book Killing Time, an 18-year odyssey from death row to freedom. Also joining us is David Angel. He's an Assistant District Attorney in Santa Clara, California, and he's also the Director of the county's Convictions Integrity Unit. Thank you both for joining us today. All right, so David, first to you. In Santa Clara, you had one of the first convictions integrity units in the country. Could you take us through why that was created, how does it work, and what are the benefits of it?
Sure. Well, it was created like a lot of things, a little bit by accident and some degree of randomness. But essentially what happened was prior to the creation of the unit, my wife, who was a state public defender at the time, had directed me to some research concerning ways that lineups could be improved for eyewitness identification. And she asked whether our county, the county I was working at, was using those protocols. And so, of course, I said, yes, of course we're using it. If those are the best protocols, I'm sure we're doing it. And then, as is probably not uncommon in marriages, then I quickly went to look to find out if we were doing it, found out we weren't, found out virtually nobody was at that time. This was, now it's become much more common using double-blind and sequential lineups. Ended up doing quite a bit of research on it and thinking that this seemed like a much more reliable way of doing identifications. Brought that to the attention of my supervisor and to the district attorney at that time, George Kennedy. This is quite a, I want to say about 14 years ago now. And ended up meeting with all the chiefs of police, and we ended up adapting it as a county. That went pretty well, and the district attorney, George Kennedy, thought, I'd like to find out if there are other things like this that we could be doing that could improve our system. And so started to task me to do that more and more. And at some point, he then formalized it. So instead of this being an assignment I was doing in addition to my normal duties as a line prosecutor, for something to do full time. What we found, I think, is what a lot of DA's offices who create conviction integrity units find is when you first do it especially, there's going to be a pent-up demand of inmates, family members, public defenders, defense attorneys who say, hey, wait, I have this case that I want you to look at. And so that's what I started spending more of my time doing. So that's kind of the story of how it was created. It started off kind of as a boutique project where it was really just me working on the sidelines with an investigator within the office. And then with our new district and our current district attorney, Jeff Rosen, it was really one of the centerpieces of his campaign to become a district attorney, was that he believes that the integrity of the process is as important as the results that we get and is inextricably tied to those results. And so it's now shifted to a kind of a new version, a more robust version, so that it's now, instead of being a boutique side project, it's a central part of the organization. I'm part of executive management of the office. I'm one of the 5 assistants in the office, and so it's taken a more central role. So that's kind of the story of its creation and its current setup.
So just as a follow-on, so how and why do you take cases and how do you investigate them briefly?
Okay, well, so there's 2 parts to what we do, what I consider proactive and retroactive. The proactive, which in some ways I find the most exciting, is trying to look of what can we do for our cases going forward in the future to try to reduce the risk of wrongful conviction in the first place. Or I should say, wrongful acquittal. In other words, are there things that we should have done and could have done better to remove doubts from a case for someone who actually committed the crime? So we try to look to improve practices going forward. However, we also look retroactively where somebody says, hey, I was convicted and I shouldn't have been. And essentially what happens there is we'll get a letter, sometimes from an individual, sometimes from a lawyer, and we look at every one of those requests that we get. However, our criteria is going to be different than say a innocence project that's on the outside. For us, we really need to see some allegation or some sense that there's new evidence that was not already considered by the jury. It's very important to me that we not be perceived at, nor do we start acting like some 13th juror who can just, hover over any case and decide, what was wrong or what was right, and instead to, try to only look at cases where there's some sort of allegation of new evidence, or else some feeling that the process itself was so flawed that it's given us, hesitancy about feeling confident in the verdict.
So John, if you could please talk a little bit about what the mission and the approach is of the Quatrone Center and what you're working on.
Sure. The Quatrone Center was created about a year and a half ago to address some of the more proactive approaches that David discussed. As he said, over the course of the past probably 25 years, and certainly in the last 15 years, there have been a number of cases of people being exonerated and found innocent of crimes for which they were convicted. That's led to a great deal of awareness of problems in the system. And convictions integrity units like David's and others have come up as a mechanism for addressing and redressing some of those cases. One of the things that's great about the Santa Clara office where David is that it also then tries to take those learnings and apply them proactively to improve the system upstream. And the Quatrone Center really exists to do that, to take principles, not only things we've learned from these cases, but principles from other industries that have complex systems but have successfully reduced errors and created a more reliable system, places like aviation and healthcare. And then we want to partner with agencies like the Santa Clara District Attorney's Office or a public defender's office or even a court to implement and test potential changes. So things like the eyewitness identification protocol that David and his office looked at, tested, and implemented, which we can certainly assume have reduced the possibility of an unintended false conviction. And so we're looking to implement those things and then help disseminate their broad adoption.
So you mentioned examples from aviation and healthcare. Could you give one or two examples that might cast some light on how your approach works?
Sure. So, for example, if in an aviation context, the easiest example of a tragic unintended error is obviously a plane crash. In aviation, what might happen when a plane crashes is the National Transportation Safety Board comes to the scene with a number of subject matter experts across a variety of disciplines. They will interview not just all of the people who were involved in anything having to do with the plane and that flight, from baggage handlers to air traffic controllers to the crew, the maintenance crew. They will also then connect that to various processes, procedures, and systems that are known to be best practices in the industry. And from that, they will try to understand not so much who's to blame, not in a blame-focused way, but entirely looking to improve safety. What happened that caused this plane to crash? I think if you were to translate that into what we're trying to do in criminal justice, what we would do in a case where somebody in a prosecutor's office or a public defender's office were to say, hey, we think something went wrong here, a result was reached that wasn't what the system intended, is we would convene a group, an interdisciplinary group, and it would probably consist of participants from the police, the prosecutor's office, the public defenders, the courts, perhaps the media, We would interview people who were involved in the case or the investigation. We would then take those interviews and sit down with experts in, for example, eyewitness identification or interrogation techniques or records management to make sure that all evidence had been handled in an appropriate way. And then we would make recommendations about how an office might be able to change its procedures upstream so that not only are we addressing the error that has happened in the past, but we're changing the circumstances and the environment to prevent that error from happening in the future.
That's great. So, David, to you now. As the director of the CIU in Santa Clara, how important has it been to have the Convictions Integrity Unit? And with that, what kind of errors have you found? And as a follow-on, if I could, to what extent has it helped with community and relations in terms of transparency and interactions with the public?
Sure. Well, I start by answering that by following up to what John just said, because I have really over time come to believe about one of the most important shifts that can be made is from a sort of black and white binary blame version of trying to analyze the problem and a more systemic and I would say risk management approach. And I think the example of the aviation is a really good one. Normally when there's a problem in life, well, actually, let me rephrase it. Actually, normally when there's a problem in life, my observation in our culture is we tend to try to find who's at fault and then blame them and then say, okay, look, we've solved this problem because we found the bad apple here. And we see this over and over again. And I don't think that this is, sometimes it's appropriate. After all, I'm in a prosecutor's office. I mean, we do hold people responsible. There's a time and a place for it. But frequently, if you're trying to solve a problem in your life, I think most people find that trying to find the one person to blame is not a really effective way of addressing the problem. And I actually think that issues of errors in the criminal justice system really get, you have so much work to do before you can even face the problem because you'll have two sides or three sides all pointing the finger, trying to, leave one person kind of carrying the bag for every failure in society. And I think that's madness. That's not to say that nobody should ever be held responsible. Sometimes they need to be. But really, that should not be our instinct or our go-to for every time there's a problem that somebody must be at fault and we're going to find out who they are and punish them. And one of the reasons I think that's a bad idea is I remember I served as a deputy on the California Commission for the Fair Administration of Justice. And it was a commission set up by the state to try to look systemically at these issues. And it did a lot of great work. But I often found that the actors who were representing agencies who were the most resistant to change were also the most adamant that if they ever found a prosecutor who did X, whatever it is, they'd fire them. If they ever found a police officer who did this, their career would be, finished. They'd fire them. But in fact, they never found anyone who did those things because the barrier to finding any error was placed so high. And you first had to decide that this was a bad person, before you could decide they made a mistake, that you never got on to looking at the problem. And that's kind of crazy. We don't grade children's math homework by first deciding if they're foolish or good or bad. You just look at whether they made a mistake or not and then try to address it. Now, for us, especially, it's very hard to say when you look at a case, here's the one mistake that was made. In my experience, when things go wrong, it's the proverbial perfect storm. Like our system actually I think is really quite good at ferreting out one or two things that would go wrong. The defense attorney is going to figure it out, or the judge, or a supervisor, or more often than not the prosecutor before it ever gets to trial. The danger happens is where you have multiple errors creeping in. When I said I like doing proactive work in some ways more, is it's very positive. You feel like you're making a change in the future. But what's disheartening about it is, of course, you never hear about the plane that didn't crash, right? So you can make these improvements, and the sum total of the recognition that you're going to get is the absence of something bad happening. You're not going to know about the person who was never charged with a crime he didn't commit. You're not going to know about the victim who's never harmed because the right person was picked up in the first place. But look, the leading sources of error are at this point no real mystery. Sincere but wrongful identification, I think is the leading cause. Problems about false confessions or inaccurate, statements, where the prosecutor, the judge, the jury don't have an accurate record of what really happened. And then, of course, what's been called prosecutorial misconduct, but I have, my crusade is to have it relabeled prosecutorial error, but some error made by the prosecutor, usually involving discovery, where there's a problem in getting all the discovery in a timely and accurate fashion to the defense. These are, really well known as the leading causes, and they're all systemic problems that cannot be eliminated but can be reduced. And we've tried to take steps to do that.
Okay. John, did you want to add something to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, David, I don't know if you've got a PhD in organizational management, but you just rattled off sort of a treatise on how a non-blame approach works. And one of the challenges that I think we find, and David alluded to this, is the issue with immediately wanting to ascribe blame. I think that gets enhanced in criminal justice because we have an adversarial system. So the checks and balances that we've established put people at odds by definition. And while that can be a very good way to evaluate something for its truth, it can also become a little bit of a barrier when you're trying to solve a problem that isn't caused by somebody's bad faith or being competitive. So part of what we try to do, as David said, is, when you have an error in criminal justice, invariably, and let's take a sincere but unintended misidentification by an eyewitness. The police have validate that eyewitness in a sense. The eyewitness ID is made, the police don't pick up that it's inaccurate, nor is there necessarily any reason why they should. That probably is also passed on by a supervisor. It gets presented to a prosecutor. The prosecutor takes it from the police and moves it forward. But then the defense attorneys are unable to identify that it's false a lot of the time, nor is the judge. So you have not only, from a system perspective, not only has the law enforcement component failed to work accurately and the prosecutorial component, but the checks and balances are also not up to the task. Now, there's no way that you would believe that every single one of those people is, quote unquote, to blame, but the system hasn't worked right because both the individual error has occurred and the protections that we have failed to work as intended. And I think when you begin to approach the problem that way, you begin to create a collaborative space where people can say, okay, we not only need to improve the detection piece within law enforcement, we need to improve that throughout the system and kind of bring people together in a way to enhance things. The other thing that I would say to David's point, he listed, I think, a lot of the errors as we know them. One of the big issues that we have is that one of our big checks and balances about whether somebody is factually innocent or guilty is the trial process and putting people in front of a judge, in front of a jury to tell their stories. The fact of the matter is that in our system, 97% or so of all cases are then managed by a plea bargain. And people are essentially making contractual arrangements about how to handle the adjudication of their criminal charges at that point, and we really don't know how many errors are happening in that process.
Right. So we certainly want to get to ways in which we can detect some of the errors that you, David, and John, that you talked about, as well as how to get at some of the best practices to prevent errors. But first, David, I'm just curious, talking about the Convictions Integrity Unit you run, talking about a blame-free environment, and it seems like you've established one. What has been the participation of and the reaction of some of the key constituents in this process? Defense attorneys, law enforcement, judges, the public? Just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Honestly, it's been really uniformly positive. We fortunately, look, relationships within a community, you can't build them overnight, you don't tear them down overnight. We're all very mindful of events in Ferguson and other places. And I believe that, you build these relationships up one action at a time, one day at a time. And obviously when something very tragic happens, like in Ferguson, what's revealed is just how bad those relationships had been over a long period of time. I bring that up because when you're going to do something like conviction integrity, the first people we went to was law enforcement. Remember when I was talking about eyewitness identification. And I recall those meetings, and I recall that the chiefs were all skeptical. They thought this was a pretty foolish idea and not necessary. But we had a really good relationship with them. We met with the chiefs regularly. We had two-way communication. So they were really willing to give it a shot. They said, if you think it's a good idea, I mean, not me personally, but the DA, then that's good enough for us to try it. And let's report back in 6 months and see how it goes. Similarly, to the other extreme, with the Northern California Innocence Project, which is, in our backyard, and with our public defender, because we've had long-standing relationships with them, they're willing to trust us to try to set these sort of protocols in place, and they don't immediately assume it's just window dressing or we're just doing it to, get some quick good press. But these are all things you have to earn over time. And what that means, for example, when I've talked to other DA's offices, I said, look, set up regular meetings with these stakeholders, with the innocence projects in your area or the advocacy groups, and most especially the public defender and the defense bar. But I've also followed it up and said, meetings alone are not enough. You have to actually be open to hearing what they say and collaborating when it's appropriate. It can't just be a PR exercise. If it really is communication, then you're going to find you don't have to agree all the time, just like you don't have to agree all the time in anything in life. So with that kind of setup, it's gone really well. The community where I'm from, I think they really expect the district attorney's office to be run in the most professional manner possible, and that they trust we make efforts to do it. And as John knows, we've had mistakes that we've made, but I think one of the reasons we've been able to retain trust of a lot of people, even when we make mistakes, is because, we've been very transparent about it. We've said, here's something, it's our error, this is what we're doing to try to fix it, this is what we've discovered. And let me quickly reassure you, it's not like the public defenders, the press just say, that's fine, we won't look too. No, everyone does their job, but they don't assume that we're lying. They don't assume we're covering something up. And when I say we're going to look into it, people believe that we really are going to look into it and evaluate it that way. So I think a conviction integrity unit can be really central to that. And I think prosecutors will find that when mistakes happen, and they will, and when there's some crisis that happens, and it will, if you've spent time building up these relationships, building up trust, that the community will, in fact, help you get through that crisis as opposed to seeing you as part of the problem.
So John, so that's a very interesting model and unit that David has, but that is by no means a universal practice in every state or municipality. So curious to hear about some of the stakeholders that the Quatrone Center has been convening to address some of these systemic questions in the justice system. What's your approach and what has the response been like?
Well, we're actually doing a survey right now. There are about 20 jurisdictions across the United States that have followed Santa Clara's lead and Dallas's lead and created convictions integrity units. And they've all created themselves somewhat ad hoc and a little bit differently. And so some of them are more mature, more robust than others, and different processes. And so one of the things that we're doing is actually surveying the units and how they operate. And the next step in that research is then to go out and survey some of the external stakeholders in the communities where they operate to see what structures are most likely to get the sort of positive responses and build the positive relationships throughout the jurisdiction that David has developed in Santa Clara. I think that there are a number of challenges that a convictions integrity unit has, and David touched on many of them. First is that you have to build those relationships, and that requires strong leadership, people who are really committed to it. And that's true, when you make a change when the district attorney makes a change within the DA's office, you need strong leadership and a strong commitment to culture and ability to articulate that in a way that is palatable to all of the prosecutors in that office. So that's step one. But then, as David has said, you need to go farther. If it requires a change to your eyewitness identification practices, Jeff Rosen or David Angel don't actually have control over that. The Santa Clara Police Department has control over that. And so you then have to build that consensus and credibility to do something like that. And that gets even harder when you then move to the public defenders, given the adversarial nature of the process. So that requires not just strong leadership, but openness, transparency, and credibility over time. What I think happens, though, is exactly what happened to the Santa Clara office. David referenced an error that they made, and that's actually, I think, taking too much responsibility for them. The error actually happened in their crime lab, or one of the ones that we could talk about, happened in a crime lab. Obviously drug tests get assessed in a crime lab, and there are certain chemical reagents that you need to look for the presence of certain illegal substances. So in this instance, a technician in the crime lab unwittingly grabbed the wrong reagent from a shelf. This is very analogous to an error that happens in healthcare, where you might have two medicines next to each other with similar markings, and one is 10 times the dose of another, and you can have a medication error without intending to. So that sort of thing happened in the crime lab. The question was, what was the extent of it? And what the Santa Clara office did was they held a press conference. They said, this is the error that happened. We don't believe there's any bad faith here. We're going to investigate the extent of it and decide what cases have to be reopened and re-reviewed, and we will let you know how that happens as quickly as possible. They then followed through on that pledge, and that's the sort of thing that builds that accountability, that credibility, not just with your peers, but with the people that report to you and with the community. And while David's correct that you don't see the plane crash that never happens, the fact of the matter is that thousands of people more every day fly because the safety record of the aviation industry has gotten better and better over time. And what I think you see is that prosecutors like David and Jeff in the Santa Clara office, people respond to that by going to the polls. Everybody has more confidence that the justice system is getting the right guy in the right way, and that it's being open and honest about how it conducts its business. That's a better public official, and that's somebody that you're more likely to vote for.
So if I can
Sure, please.
One of the reasons that we now, when this unit was first founded, I think I told you under the original District Attorney George Kennedy, he called it his Internal Innocence Project. And Jeff Rosen changed the name to Conviction Integrity. And among the reasons he did this was he said, hey, look, this is about both sides of the equation. It's about making sure we don't convict the wrong person. That's a priority. But it's also integrity. We're also using it in the sense of structural integrity, the strength of the process. And to give an example of eyewitness identification, to my knowledge, we have not had a single case reversed due to a bad identification since we've adapted our new policy. We've had a plummeting use of defense experts in eyewitness cases. And in general, we've had our juries much more likely to rely upon an eyewitness identification that we have, because we can in good faith say, look, here's these protocols that we're transparent about them. They are, as far as we can tell, a best practice. We have continued to tweak them. So for example, a few years ago, we mandated that they are all videotaped so that people can look at them afterwards. Well, this helps at both ends. It helps you, obviously, to prevent the wrong person being picked out in the first place. But it means when you're in trial that jurors, members of the public, they're just more likely to believe that this is accurate if they can see you have, in a deep way, made a commitment to try to do things accurately from the outset.
Great, thank you. So John, as a follow-on to one of the earlier questions, talk a little bit about unintended and sometimes tragic outcomes. And with cases like this, the stakes are very high, both for someone who may or may not been on the receiving end of an error and someone who may have made the error. I'm curious, being as we are here at Penn, do you find that it's easier or not in academia to address these questions versus, say, a prosecutor's office or a public defender's office?
We've done these sorts of reviews and partnered with participants in the criminal justice system to identify and learn from errors in a couple of different contexts. And it's interesting. Sometimes you'll find just an individual agency that wants to do this and have it all be internal. And obviously there's some benefit to that. And when the advantage to that is that it's much easier to implement the changes because it's all coming through a single vertical change of command. We're actually involved in a review exercise right now that is being sponsored in part by the National Institute of Justice, in which here in Philadelphia, we're looking at a case in partnership with the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, some defense counsel in the Philadelphia area, the Philadelphia Police Department, and the media. And what's interesting in that case is, as I said, it's obviously more complex with all of the other players, what we're learning to do is how to build that credibility that David's talking about, where when we say, actually, we think there may be something that could be improved in one agency, that agency doesn't view it as criticism from the other agency, but rather constructive assistance. And I think having a neutral partner in the center of that ring of agencies has been essential to that process. And so, just as an example, I mentioned the need to do interviews with the actual participants who took part in the case where something went wrong. The agencies involved decided that it was essential that they not interview each other because of the political ramifications that that would cause. And so we came up with a process where somebody from the Quatrone Center and an external expert who served in the same role would interview. So for example, if we were interviewing a homicide detective, it might be me and a homicide detective from another jurisdiction would interview that person. And the reason that we would do that is because it's non-threatening. Neither of us have any management authority or political clout over the individual. And so they feel more at ease. And because we have an expert who does the same job as the person we're interviewing, there's somebody there who can sort of say, yeah, that makes sense. I understand why you would do that. Did you consider the following, part of the scenario? And so it's a more in-depth interview, but also a less threatening interview, so that we can really get at, because when somebody makes a mistake, a good faith mistake happens because you have somebody trying to do something, and whatever the scenario they see at the moment in time, they're then making a decision based on that. So you have to be careful not to Monday morning quarterback that. You have to make sure you're looking at the world through their eyes so that you can avoid the scenario that they see where they then make the decision that goes in an unintended way. So there's a researcher named James Reasons who does organizational management work who has a great quote on this. He says, we can't change the human condition, right? Humans make mistakes. We can't change the human condition, but we can change the conditions in which humans operate. And that's really what this is about. How do we create an environment for the decision that makes all the facts clear so that a decision that goes in the way the system wants it to go is what results? And I think having that neutral academic participant in the center of that ring has really been essential to building that kind of collaboration.
Right. No, thank you. That's great. So really for both of you, David and John as well, so you're running a conviction integrity unit that seems to be quite successful, David. John, you've got this multi-stakeholder project in which the Quatrone Center is a neutral academic convener and actor. Let's talk a little bit about best practices. So CIUs are not universal across jurisdictions and states in America. How do we get at some of these best practices? Is it through the collection of data? Is it through the head or heads of one CIU talking with others? How do we improve the integrity of the criminal justice system while reducing chances that there could be systemic errors? David, to you first, please.
Well, it's all of the above, right? I think that right now, relatively new, I know that the Department of Justice is funding, Fred, I can't recall the name right now, but sort of a prosecutorial best practices group, of which I'm a participant and my county's a member, run by a really brilliant woman who's, I think, was previously with the Manhattan DA's office. So that's one part of the puzzle. That's not going to be the whole part for a variety of reasons. First of all, just prosecutors. And secondly, we don't always agree. So to take the example of eyewitness identification, Manhattan quite famously has a different view than we do on the best way to do it. Just because the data is there doesn't mean everyone's going to interpret the data the exact same way. But I do think even so that's a big improvement because you're at least looking, trying to look rationally and scientifically at the data. I think it's fair enough for people to come to different conclusions, but there's often large areas of agreement. So for example, to take the eyewitness identification example, I've been to spectacularly heated arguments of whether sequential is better than simultaneous and back and forth. But what's interesting to me is when I first entered those debates, 14 years ago, not only was that controversial, but people also thought it was controversial whether you needed it to be double blind. People also thought it was controversial whether you needed to take confidence statements. I mean, in other words, I could go down 4 or 5 different things that can improve eyewitness identification. And now all but like one or two of them are accepted as, well, it really is a best practice. Despite that acceptance, there's a huge number of agencies that just aren't doing it. So I think that having this sort of prosecutorial group with guidance from the DOJ is really helpful. But like anything else, you really need all of the above. I think you need outside advocacy groups to push, because there's going to be a natural inertia in the system. And we all have different biases that are, when John was talking about the answer from before, internal groups have the advantage of being able to, kind of get things done. They're much more nimble. They can move more quickly. But, it's sometimes hard for us to see faults when there are our own faults. On the other hand, I've been to outside groups, and I think sometimes they can fall prey to the first problem we talked about. Since they don't know any of the people, intellectually, it's always easier to say, that person really messed up, and nobody punished them. And often their debate doesn't get farther than that. So I think by bringing these different groups and perspectives together, I think that can really help get the word out there. And then recognize it's not one size fits all. I mean, a conviction integrity unit, for example, our county, a fairly large county, fairly large office, but dwarfed by the side of the Brooklyn DA's office or the Manhattan DA's office. They're going to have unique issues. By contrast, I've gone and presented to district attorney's offices where there might be 4 prosecutors. Well, there's no way they're going to have a standalone conviction integrity unit that eats up 50% of their workforce. So, you need to be flexible in that way as well.
John, ideas to share information or data or move forward some of these ideas for best practices?
Well, hopefully that's something that an academic center like the Quatrone Center is well positioned and well skilled to do. I mean, I think if we're doing our job right, what we're really doing is working with bright spots like the Santa Clara DA's office, like the San Francisco Public Defender's office, like the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, and we're working with all of those groups and synthesizing knowledge and then disseminating it out to a broader audience. Because change doesn't happen all at once. Change happens by a thought leader talking to another thought leader, and that expanding over time. And so the things that an academic institution is well equipped to do is to sort of gather that data in an objective way, analyze it rigorously, and publicize the results. And what the Quatrone Center then hopes to add on to that is the collaboration with these practitioners so that we're testing the proposed improvements and optimizations, and that becomes an iterative process for change. And I think over time that's going to happen. We'll be able to differentiate the enhancements that are working well from those that aren't having an effect. And hopefully, one of the great things about partnering with different jurisdictions is you see exactly what David said. A large urban environment is going to have different needs than a smaller rural environment. And the challenge that you have is not just the acceptance of the idea and the philosophy, but the challenge of implementation. And a wonderful idea that's never implemented doesn't have the real world impact that we're striving for. And so I think as we grow and build those collaborations, we'll get better also at synthesizing the implementation differences that you need to have to ensure that the uptake is actually effective. Because you really do, if you're trying to improve the system and looking at it as a system and not just individual cases, you want each part of that system to be operating to maximize the goals of the people within it. And you want to make sure that you're helping law enforcement identify the right people right off the bat. You want to make sure that you're helping prosecutors vet their cases and prosecute the right people. You want to make sure that you're helping public defenders and courts protect everybody's constitutional freedoms and operate the whole process efficiently. And I think it's those collaborations and the implementation of the ideas that's the other part of it as well.
Great.
I think another thing that John, to build off what John said, that I think his organization is so well suited for is that over time, if both defense attorneys and prosecutors can have experts in different areas that you grow to have faith and trust in, then as problems come up, they can be the people you can consult to at least get you started in getting at the right answer. All too often, in my experience, we tend to use experts, but in this totally artificial and adversarial way. So, if it's about abusive head trauma or eyewitness identification or false convictions, all that happens is everyone finds some academic or expert who's going to say whatever it is that needs to be said to advance their side of the case. And that, that's fine for that individual case, but it doesn't really help you design the best system over time. What over time, when you develop these relationships with an expert you can rely upon, well, that means when there's some new issue, you can call them up to get an actual expert opinion, as opposed to calling them up to say, here's what we do, tell me, or here's what their expert said was bad. And this is where I think the Quatrone Center and John's group, especially by working over time with, public defenders and district attorneys and different community members, as that trust builds up, well, that means, every time there's a new study on, for example, eyewitness identification, we don't have to start from scratch. We can say, hey, who are the experts that we really relied on before? What do they think about it? And that can allow you to build to new and better practices.
Great. So if we could, let's talk a little bit about some of the thornier and high-profile issues that have been covered in the news lately in New York, in Ferguson, in Cleveland. How do we even begin to address some of the issues here? How could some of the work that you're doing now potentially be applied in some of these cases and instances?
Well, the interesting thing about some of these principles of safety or reliability or quality in large complex systems is that what's been clear is that the principles themselves are pretty universal. So anytime you've got principles that work in aviation, healthcare, manufacturing, nuclear power, those are clearly some pretty universal principles because they're operating in a lot of very different environments. Criminal justice shares the necessary complexity, the necessary fragmentation, the necessary number of well-intended participants, and the high-risk, zero tolerance for error thing with all of these other systems. And so it makes sense that these principles should be applied. I think if you were to look at a tragedy like what happened in Ferguson or a tragedy like the Garner case in New York, the question is, our emotions get so charged with the need to blame, and perhaps there is a need for punishment in those situations, but it's important to step back for a second and say, okay, clearly it's an unintended outcome, right? I don't think there's a police office in the world that thinks that any civilian death is a desirable outcome. And so once we realize that we have an unintended outcome, then we can use these same principles to go back and figure out, how did we get into this situation? And, for example, I know a lot of research is happening right now on police engagement. So the moment at which a police officer engages with a citizen, how is that being done? And are there specific techniques that we can test and teach that will reduce the level of tension or emotion in that initial outreach that will do that? I mean, I think in the Ferguson case, for example, if there had been tasers in the car or options for non-lethal force, if there had been two people in that car, two police officers in that car, that might have ratcheted the tension down. If there had been better relationships with the community, certainly, I think that would have ratcheted that down. And a just culture sort of blame-free event review, as opposed to a litigation process, is simply going to uncover different facts. That's not to say that you don't still need an appropriate prosecution, perhaps, for some of those circumstances. But when you're looking just for the safety of the system, you end up looking for different things in different ways. And so I, for one, think that if you were to conduct the sort of investigation we've discussed here, or the kind of thing that the Santa Clara Convictions Integrity Unit might do for a case where innocence is at issue, if you were to sit down and go through all those grand jury documents, for example, with experts, you might go back and propose procedural changes to the way the police department goes about things and to the way community activists talk to their communities about how to engage with the police. You would probably also have recommendations for the prosecutor's office. Those are going to be simply different recommendations than whatever the Ferguson grand jury is going to come back with on what should happen to that police officer. And so I think that's the potential value add, is it can be a separate parallel investigation that's designed to prevent the next mistake, whereas the grand jury investigation is really just designed to hold somebody accountable.
Right. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, but and I would augment it by saying, I think the events in Ferguson happened well before that fatal encounter, and the problem there is you presented two very different versions of it. The police officer version, that he was utterly justified because he was defending himself against really a madman. And then the witnesses who disagree with him say really the exact opposite, which is that, with very little provocation and certainly no threat to his safety, he essentially executed someone on the street for having a bad attitude. It's very hard to get to the bottom of which one of those is true. And you had a lot of witnesses, each pointing both ways. I have my opinions about it after having read a lot of the grand jury transcript, which probably are not relevant. But I think Ferguson happened well before that moment, meaning that you had allowed a denigration in community relations and training that predates that moment. There's a reason why the community in Ferguson immediately believed the worst. And maybe they believe the worst because the worst is actually true. But there's a reason why they had no trust in any of the authorities involved. I'm not trying to imply by that means the authorities were wrong in everything they did before or since, but I'm just saying you had let a situation devolve so badly over time. And I don't think you can fix that at that moment. One of the reasons is, as John points out, at that point, the only relevant question is what happened exactly that, I think mid-afternoon or not. Where I think conviction integrity units can help is in some ways the way they reflect an ideology or a fundamental principle of of a prosecutor's office, of a governmental entity, which is that I think the communication has to be ongoing, that an ability to recognize that risk, error, mistake, and risk of it is ever present, that we should be affirmatively looking at ways of reducing it. When it comes to race, obviously you have to recognize that biases that are part of every prosecutor, every cop, every judge, every public defender, every member of the community, those have to be factored into how you run your business. Like, how are you going to factor those in to try to make it more fair? So, for example, we've trained directly on this issue of implied bias. It was actually one of the first moves of our district attorney to take all of his senior management to the Tolerance Museum, I think it's called, in Los Angeles, which has trainings just on this issue, along with command staff from San Jose PD and others. So I don't think you can solve some of these, really upsetting things that we see in the paper that moment by like one particular fix. But I think, as John said, if you're engaging in a process over time, then I think you're going to be building up trust. And I think you're going to be more likely to avoid these errors at that moment if you've laid the groundwork for it. But they're just too complicated and too deep to think that you're going to solve it at that moment if you haven't already started the hard work.
Right. The other thing that's true, just to build on David's point, is there are a myriad of different types of errors that happen, and it would be naive to think that one investigation is going to uncover them all. What you really want to do is implement a culture of self-improvement, continuous self-improvement, so that what will happen a lot in aviation is near misses will outnumber actual incidents by 100, 200 to 1. And so you'll get people self-reporting now in the aviation industry. They report about 60,000 incidents a month where something didn't go wrong, but it could have, except for something. And these are from very, very small consequences to potentially more substantial. But it's that culture of continuous self-improvement, and once the convictions integrity unit is set up, making sure that it's a part of the regular operating of the office, and doing that in various environments throughout the criminal justice system is what will ultimately lead to the blanketed reduction in errors across the board. Because the errors that led to a Ferguson, we can deal with those, but then it's a little bit of whack-a-mole, because there will be another error that comes up and we'll need to be aware of that, and then we'll get rid of that and see where the next one is. And it's that cyclical process that we really need to strive for.
So talk a little bit, please, about what other actors in the criminal justice system can do, particularly the public, many members of the public of whom are very upset and concerned. And it seems like one of the most viable ways to voice that concern and engage is through protest. So we've talked about blame-free environments to investigate where and how unintended outcomes occurred, how they can be mitigated or prevented. We've talked a little bit about a just culture, but what can members of the public do to actually help this process along, whether through the assistance or an allegiance with watchdogs, with the media, and so on? John, to you.
Sure. I mean, I think there's two things that I think would really help. The first thing is when you've got a public official who is willing to be transparent, be accountable, be communicative and clear about how he or she is trying to address problems. And when you have a public official who's brave enough to step up and acknowledge how they're going to address an error as opposed to trying to hide the error, you should vote for that person, because that's the person that you want in that public office, because at some point maybe you're brought into the criminal justice system, and at that point you want to know that your case is going to be handled in that way. The other thing that I think that we as citizens can do and the general public can do is to engage with the media in a slightly different way. I think one of the challenges with a 24-hour news cycle is there's a natural gravitation to sensationalism. And so when a politician does admit that an error has happened, and then they take steps to correct the error, it's far too common for the media to continue harping on the error and not to also talk about the steps that have been taken to address the error and the public courage that takes. I think we should actually hold the media up to a higher standard as well, to be sort of objective in what they're reporting and not just report the sensationalist aspects. Raising that and making sure that we don't just talk about the errors, but we talk about the bright spots and the things that people do to make our system better. Because there are far more of them than are often publicized. I think that's the other thing the public can and should do, is to make sure that we're also talking about the positive. That's going to inspire more people to build the kind of office that exists in Santa Clara.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, I agree with all of those. I guess I want to make sure I clarify at the beginning in the question you said, the importance of a blame-free environment. And I do want to make clear, I don't mean that nobody should ever be held responsible. I mean, sometimes people do, and they need to be. I just meant that, if your paper is delivered late, most people don't assume, wow, that delivery guy, he must be a real criminal. I mean, they just assume something must have been wrong, and how can we fix the problem? I think that's how we should start, with assuming that the problem is not necessarily willful, but, a systemic one. But that doesn't mean if you discover that there were misconduct of some sort, people should be held accountable appropriately. And as for the public, I think by remaining educated, there's a time and a place where protest is essential for any change. But it is nice if it goes beyond that. And I also think that, as John said, recognizing when you have leaders who are, doing the right thing, to vote and to be supportive of that. And I would also say for our police officers and others, I don't think it's consistent. I've often seen circumstances where, some members of the public just don't really seem to care if those police officers, their salaries are cut, they don't have good equipment, and they're just treated very poorly. And then, turn around and being scandalized if they don't have the best officers they can have. I think to recognize that while these tragedies have happened, and there are bad apples, overwhelmingly, as we saw in New York with those two police officers who were essentially assassinated by what seems like a very mentally ill, angry man, and this outpouring of community support of what a great job they did every day. We have officers as I say, I have a difficult job, everyone has a difficult job, but if I hear gunshots, I run the other way. They all run towards it. So I'm not saying that they get a blank slate. Of course, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, hey, recognize that these people deserve your support too for doing a very difficult job. And, it goes both ways, as I said, because I feel like our office, because we have been out there and proactive and try to meet with people before problems happen and address them, I think it's given us credibility and it's given us leverage with them. And it goes the other way around. I think if you feel like from within the system, if you're dealing with outside groups, whether citizen groups or others, who really want to work with you to improve things, it's going to be a very different dynamic. Now, that can't necessarily be created in the heat of a tragedy, but it can be created over time.
So when we talk about a blame-free event review, we're not talking about an accountability-free performance evaluation. So the term that gets used a lot in organizational management circles is a just culture. And what you want is a culture that understands that good faith people can make errors. In the case we talked about of the technician in the crime lab who just used the wrong reagent. That's an unintended and an error that could happen to anybody. That person should be trained, should be communicated with, should make sure they understand how they can prevent it from happening in the future. That person may not need to be fired. You may also have a situation where you've got somebody who is creating tests that were never done, right? Doing something that's intentional or malicious or reckless. And there, it is important to hold that person accountable. It is important to take action to deal with that. What the history of reviews of this sort has shown us is that the bad apples are vastly outnumbered by the good faith actors, but the good faith actors are watching too to make sure that they see how you handle the bad actors. And so part of this, as we're talking about implementing cultural change and a culture of continual self-improvement, is that idea of a just culture, which is appropriately balancing the blame-free event review to understand precisely what changes need to be made, but also looking at the actors and their motivators and holding them to an appropriate professional standard. And I think that's really important to stress, because when we talk about blame-free, we're not talking about accountability-free.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree with that more, and I think that term, just culture, is a really good one. And just to augment that, if you have an environment where nobody's ever held accountable, we all know what'll happen in that environment. It'll be very negative. On the other hand, if you have an environment where any error is going to be manufactured into a scandal for which one individual is going to, expected to shoulder the weight of all the problems in the criminal justice system, or whatever you have, like one teacher is going to be the symbol for everything that's wrong with the public schools and so on. Well, what are you going to create? You're going to create an environment where nobody ever wants to admit to error, where people try to hide errors when they have them or minimize them. And a leading source of error are the problems that you don't know about. And you don't know about it because people don't tell you about the near misses. So that's why I think this just culture that John alludes to, it's so important, not only just because it's fair and it's right, but I think without it, you're going to end up in a situation where you're constantly, as you said, playing whack-a-mole, because you're never going to see it until it pops out in some uncontrollable way. Whereas if you create an environment where people can readily admit to a mistake and know that they'll be treated like a human being who made a mistake, it is really central to moving forward. I guess what I would say about science is I think it's really important. We use science a lot in the courtroom. But science is not a static field. So there are improvements that are constantly being made. I think it's very important that the actors in the system, meaning prosecutors and others, are open to looking at old convictions if the science upon which we relied upon then is no longer deemed accurate. But on the other hand, this is one of those tricky balancing acts. You don't want to create a system that every time there's some new study or some new, incremental advance, because that will describe every piece of forensic, that suddenly the whole conviction is thrown out and you have to start all over again, which really kind of brings me to the larger balancing, and this is what I think actually John's group in the Quatrone Center is really striving to keep as well. Somebody said they wanted me to design a system to prevent, radically reduce automobile fatalities on the freeway. And I came back and said, I've come with this great idea. I'm going to drop the speed limit to 4 miles an hour. Right? Well, it would work. We drop fatalities, but our whole country would kind of grind to a standstill. It's similar in our criminal justice system. We have to have a fair system so that people who are victimized by crimes are protected and people are brought to justice. So we can't just look to solutions that only look at one side. How can we prevent any mistake from ever happening? We have to balance that over the fact that we need a real world system that's going to work with actual human beings and actual people, while still staying open, that if there are new advances or new techniques or new knowledge, that we're open to that knowledge.
Yeah. John, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think the the CSI effect is something that we've all, talked about in the criminal justice field, where, there's so much new science that's happening that there's a hope or a belief that DNA, for example, or whatever the next big forensic advance will solve all of the challenges in criminal justice and help us. And I think what DNA has been great for is, in certain cases, and when it's collected properly and used properly, in certain cases it can provide objective information about an individual's presence or lack of presence on the scene. And as people who are trying to get to the truth, we hunger for that objectivity. But it's important to point out that these are not causes of error. They're tools that we use to try to discover what's really happened. And it's important that we understand the limitations of those tools. So I think with science in the criminal justice system, one of the challenges that we have is that sometimes the science isn't advanced as we'd like it to be. Sometimes we get too excited about the science's capabilities and we later find out that it's not quite as good as we thought. And we're kind of doing that right now with hair follicle comparisons, for example, where for a while we thought that there was a wealth of very specific information you could get from a hair follicle comparison. And now as the science has matured, we're finding out that that's less the case. And so this actually sort of underscores the need for checks and balances in the system and the fact that no error occurs in a vacuum, because you'll have a situation where you have a well-intended scientific expert speaking as to the science at the time. The question then is, are our defense attorneys, judges, and juries appropriately enough educated on that science to be appropriately skeptical consumers of that testimony? And in a lot of cases, the answer is no, they're not. And so you not only get somebody who over-testifies about what the science can do, but you get people who accept that view because, well, this guy speaking is the expert and I'm not. And so I think one of the things that the Quatrone Center would like to do is help the system find a way to better strike that balance so that we're using the science that is appropriately validated and techniques that work, but also the checks and balances on the defense and court side are better educated about what that science can and can't prove, so that they're making sure that experts too are being held accountable, and we're really getting to as much of the truth and the facts as we can.
So we've had a chance to really go over some really promising approaches and responses to how to get to a just culture, how to create blame-free environments where we can find out the facts of what happened when unintended outcomes occur and hold people accountable where appropriate. So David Angel in Santa Clara, John Hollway here at Penn, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for joining us here at Case in Point.